Why did my dad choose his new wife over calling 911 for me? I was helping Dad's new wife Margot set up for her book club meeting when the ladder I was standing on suddenly shifted under my feet. One second I was hanging fairy lights across the living room ceiling, and the next I was falling backwards through the air with my arms flailing trying to grab onto something. I hit the hardwood floor so hard that the sound echoed through the whole house, and for a moment I couldn't breathe or move or do anything except lie there staring up at the ceiling fan spinning above me. Pain exploded up my spine and radiated through my whole body in waves that made my vision blur and darken at the edges. Margot rushed over and knelt beside me asking if I was okay, but when I tried to answer, nothing came out except a weird gasping sound. I attempted to sit up and immediately felt something wrong in my back, a grinding sensation that made me cry out and collapse back onto the floor. My legs felt strange and tingly like they'd fallen asleep, and when I tried to move my right leg, it wouldn't respond the way it should. Margot told me to stay still and pulled out her phone, and I thought she was calling 911, but instead she was texting someone. Dad came running in from the garage where he'd been working on his car, and his face went white when he saw me lying on the floor. I tried to tell him I couldn't feel my legs properly, but the words came out slurred and wrong. He knelt down next to me and asked what happened, and Margot explained about the ladder slipping. Dad started to reach for his phone, and Margot grabbed his wrist, saying we should wait a minute to see if I was really hurt or just shaken up. I stared at her in disbelief because I was lying on the floor unable to move my legs, and she wanted to wait and see if I was really hurt. Dad hesitated with his phone in his hand and looked between me and Margot with this conflicted expression I'd never seen before. Margot kept talking in this calm, soothing voice about how ambulances were expensive and my stepmom had always been dramatic about injuries, and maybe I just needed a few minutes to catch my breath. She said her nephew had fallen off a ladder last year and seemed really hurt at first, but was fine after lying down for a while. The tingling in my legs was getting worse and spreading up into my hips, and I could feel panic rising in my chest, making it even harder to breathe. I managed to gasp out that something was really wrong with my back and I needed help now. Dad finally started dialing 911, but Margot put her hand over his phone and said we should at least try to get me to the couch first to see if I could walk. She said if I could move on my own, then we'd know it wasn't serious enough for an ambulance. Dad actually agreed with her, and they both tried to help me sit up, and the pain that shot through my spine made me scream so loud that our neighbor's dog started barking. I collapsed back onto the floor sobbing and begging them to call for help, but Margot was still talking about how we should give it a few more minutes. She kept saying that her book club was starting in less than an hour, and having paramedics here would completely ruin the evening she'd been planning for weeks. Dad was looking at his phone, and then at Margot, and then at me, and I could see him actually weighing his options like this was a difficult decision instead of an obvious emergency. The fact that he wasn't immediately calling 911 while I lay there unable to move my legs properly made something crack inside my chest that had nothing to do with the fall. Margot suggested they could drive me to the urgent care clinic instead of calling an ambulance, saying it would be faster and cheaper and wouldn't disrupt her book club. She was already pulling up the address on her phone while I lay there on the floor trying to explain that I couldn't move, and something was seriously wrong with my spine. Dad said maybe that was a good idea and started talking about how to get me into the car, completely ignoring the fact that moving someone with a potential spinal injury without proper equipment could cause permanent damage. I'd learned that in health class just last semester, but apparently neither of them remembered or cared about that basic safety information. My vision was getting fuzzy around the edges, and the tingling sensation had spread all the way up to my chest now, and I was terrified that whatever was wrong was getting worse while they stood there debating logistics. Margot checked her watch and said if they were going to drive me to urgent care, they needed to leave right now so she could be back before her guests arrived. The casual way she said it, like my potential paralysis was just an inconvenient scheduling conflict, made me realize that Dad had married someone who genuinely didn't care if I lived or died. I tried one more time to tell them I needed an ambulance and that you're not supposed to move someone with a back injury, but Dad was already agreeing with Margot's plan. He went to pull the car into the garage while Margot stood over me explaining that the urgent care clinic was only 15 minutes away and they had x-ray machines and everything an emergency room would have. I was crying and trying to make them understand that I physically could not move my legs normally and that this was exactly the kind of situation where you call 911 no matter what. But Margot just kept checking her phone and muttering about her book club and how much work she'd put into planning this evening. Dad came back and they discussed how to lift me, and I was screaming at them not to move me, that they were going to make it worse, but they weren't listening. Margot grabbed my arms and Dad grabbed my legs, and when they lifted me off the floor, the pain was so intense that everything went white and I think I passed out for a few seconds. When my vision cleared, I was being carried through the garage and the movement was sending jolts of agony up my spine with every step they took. They managed to get me into the back seat of Dad's SUV, and I was lying across the seats crying and begging them to call an ambulance instead. Dad started the engine and Margot got in the passenger seat and gave him directions to the urgent care clinic. Every bump in the road made me scream as pain radiated through my back, and I could feel the tingling in my legs getting worse with each passing minute. Dad kept telling me to hang on and that we'd be there soon, but he was driving the speed limit and stopping properly at every red light like this was a normal trip to the store. I couldn't understand why he wasn't speeding or running red lights or doing anything that indicated he understood how serious this was. Margot was on her phone texting her book club members that she might be a few minutes late, but the meeting was still happening. She kept reassuring Dad that I would be fine and that they'd have me checked out and back home in no time. The urgent care clinic was in a strip mall between a dry cleaner and a pizza place, and when we pulled into the parking lot, I could see through the window that there were at least 6 people in the waiting room. Dad parked and they opened the back door to get me out, and the process of moving me from the car to standing made me vomit from the pain. Margot looked disgusted and stepped back to avoid getting anything on her shoes while Dad tried to support my weight. My legs wouldn't hold me properly and I kept buckling, and Dad ended up having to half carry me toward the entrance with Margot walking ahead to open doors. The people in the waiting room stared as we came in, and the receptionist's eyes went wide when she saw me. Dad explained that I'd fallen off a ladder and hurt my back and couldn't move my legs right, and the receptionist immediately said that sounded like something that needed an emergency room, not urgent care. She said they weren't equipped to handle potential spinal injuries and we should have called 911 from home. Dad and Margot exchanged looks and Margot started arguing that surely they could at least do an x-ray to see how bad it was. The receptionist was shaking her head and saying that even if they could take x-rays, they couldn't treat a spinal injury here, and we'd just end up being transferred to a hospital anyway. A nurse came out from the back and took one look at me and asked how long ago I'd fallen. When Dad said it had been about 20 minutes, her face changed completely, and she asked why they hadn't called an ambulance. Margot launched into her explanation about wanting to avoid the expense and thinking urgent care would be faster, and the nurse cut her off saying that 20 minutes was way too long to wait with a potential spinal injury, and that moving me without proper support could have caused permanent damage. She told them they needed to call 911 right now, and that I should be lying flat and immobilized until paramedics arrived. Dad finally pulled out his phone and dialed while the nurse helped me lie down on the floor of the waiting room. She was asking me questions about what I could feel and where the pain was, and when I told her about the tingling spreading up my torso, her expression got very serious. She told the other people in the waiting room to give us space, and grabbed blankets from somewhere to put under my head. Margot was standing off to the side looking annoyed and checking her watch again, and I heard her tell Dad that she was going to have to cancel her book club after all this. The paramedics arrived maybe 8 minutes later and came rushing in with a stretcher and equipment. They immediately began asking questions about the fall and what symptoms I was experiencing, and when I described the tingling and inability to move my legs properly, they exchanged worried looks. One of them asked Dad why he'd waited so long to call and why he'd moved me instead of calling from the scene. Dad started explaining about Margot thinking urgent care would be better, and the paramedic cut him off saying that with the symptoms I was describing, the delay and unnecessary movement could have serious consequences. They fitted me with a neck brace and carefully rolled me onto a backboard, securing me with straps so I couldn't move at all. The process was excruciating and I was crying and apologizing for crying, and one of the paramedics kept reassuring me that I was doing great and we'd get to the hospital soon. They loaded me into the ambulance and one of the paramedics stayed in the back with me while the other drove. I could hear the siren starting up as we pulled away from the urgent care clinic. The paramedic in the back with me was doing neurological tests, asking me to try to move different parts of my body and rating my responses. When I tried to wiggle my toes on my right foot, nothing happened, and I saw him make a note on his tablet. He started an IV and took my vital signs while explaining that we were going to the regional trauma center because they had the best neurosurgery department in the area. The word neurosurgery made my stomach drop, and I asked if that meant I needed surgery on my spine. He said they wouldn't know anything for sure until we got to the hospital and they did imaging, but with my symptoms, it was definitely a possibility. The ride seemed to take forever, even with the sirens going, and every turn made me acutely aware of how strapped down I was and how little control I had over what was happening to my body. The paramedic kept checking on me and asking questions to keep me conscious, and I told him about falling off the ladder and how long it took before anyone called for help. He didn't say anything judgmental, but I could see his jaw tighten when I mentioned the 20-minute delay. We arrived at the hospital and I was rushed through doors into what looked like a trauma bay with bright lights and lots of people in scrubs. Everyone was moving fast and talking to each other using medical terms I didn't understand. Someone cut off my shirt and started placing electrode stickers all over my chest, while someone else was examining my back. A doctor introduced herself as Dr. Okonkwo and explained they were going to do a CT scan of my spine to see what was damaged. She asked me the same questions about what I could feel and move, and when she tested the reflexes in my feet with some kind of tool, one foot responded, but the other didn't. Her face remained neutral, but I saw her exchange a look with one of the nurses. They wheeled me down a hallway into a room with a large machine and carefully transferred me onto the scanning table. The technician explained that I needed to stay completely still, and that the machine would make loud noises. The scan itself only took maybe 10 minutes, but it felt like an eternity lying there, unable to move, and wondering what they were seeing on those images of my spine. After the scan, they wheeled me to a room in what the nurse called the neuro ICU. Dad and Margot arrived about 30 minutes later, and I could hear them arguing in the hallway before they even came into my room. Dad was saying something about how Margot's book club wasn't important, and she was saying something about how she'd planned it for weeks and couldn't just cancel. When they finally came in, Margot stayed near the door while Dad came to my bedside looking shaken and guilty. He started apologizing and saying he should have called 911 right away, and I just stared at him, unable to process that he was apologizing for something that could have permanently paralyzed me. Dr. Okonkwo came in with the CT results and explained that I had a fractured vertebra in my lower spine and significant swelling of the spinal cord. She said the swelling was compressing the nerves that controlled my legs, which explained the weakness and numbness. She said I needed surgery within the next few hours to stabilize the fracture and relieve the pressure on my spinal cord, and that the delay in getting treatment had made the swelling worse. Dad's face went pale, and he asked if the delay meant permanent damage. Dr. Okonkwo said it was too early to tell, but that every minute of pressure on the spinal cord increased the risk of permanent nerve damage. She needed Dad to sign consent forms for the surgery, and she needed them signed immediately because time was critical. Dad's hands were shaking as he signed the paperwork, and Margot was still standing by the door checking her phone. Dr. Okonkwo looked at Margot and asked if she had any questions about the procedure, and Margot just shook her head and said she was sure everything would be fine. The doctor's expression suggested she had opinions about Margot's level of concern, but she kept them professional and said the surgical team was being prepped right now. 2 orderlies came in and started unlocking my bed wheels, preparing to take me to the operating room. Dad grabbed my hand and said he loved me and that I'd be okay, and I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't stop thinking about how he'd chosen Margot's book club over my safety. They wheeled me down to the surgical floor and into a prep area where an anesthesiologist introduced himself and explained what would happen during the procedure. He said they'd put me under general anesthesia and that I wouldn't feel anything or remember anything from the surgery. A nurse started adding medications to my IV and told me I'd start feeling drowsy soon. I asked her what would happen if the surgery didn't work, and she squeezed my hand and said the doctors here were the best, and I was in good hands. The last thing I remember before going under was being wheeled into a bright white operating room with lots of equipment and masked faces looking down at me. Someone told me to count backward from 10, and I got to maybe 7 before everything went black. When I woke up, I was in a different room with my throat feeling raw and my mouth incredibly dry. There was a tube down my throat, and I started panicking and trying to pull at it, but my hands were restrained and nurses rushed over telling me to stay calm. One of them explained I was still intubated because they wanted to keep me on the ventilator for a few more hours to make sure everything was stable. The tube came out later that evening and my throat hurt so badly I could barely swallow. A different doctor came in and introduced himself as Dr. Yates, the neurosurgeon who'd operated on me. He explained they'd put 2 metal rods and 6 screws in my spine to stabilize the fractured vertebra and had removed some bone fragments that were pressing on my spinal cord. He said the surgery went well, but the amount of swelling they found was concerning and indicated significant trauma to the cord. When I asked if I'd be able to walk again, he said it was too early to tell, and we'd know more over the next few days as the swelling went down. He did some neurological tests similar to what the paramedic had done, asking me to try to move my legs and feet. I could move my left leg a little, but my right leg still wasn't responding properly. Dr. Yates made notes and said we'd continue monitoring closely and start physical therapy as soon as possible. Dad came in after the doctor left and tried to hold my hand, but I pulled away. He looked hurt and asked what was wrong, and I just stared at him until he sat down and stopped trying to touch me. I spent the next 3 days in the ICU while they monitored my spine and managed my pain with medications that made everything feel fuzzy and distant. Dad came to visit every day and tried to talk to me, but I had nothing to say to him. Margot came once, stayed for maybe 10 minutes, and left saying she had things to take care of at home. On the 4th day, they moved me to a regular hospital room, and a physical therapist came to assess my mobility. She helped me try to sit up in bed, and the movement made my back scream with pain despite the medications. We worked on small movements like trying to lift my legs and flex my feet, and while my left side was responding better, my right side was still significantly impaired. The therapist said this was actually somewhat encouraging, because it meant the nerves weren't completely damaged, just severely irritated from the swelling. She said recovery would be a long process and would require intensive physical therapy, possibly for months. The word months hit me like a physical blow because I'd been hoping this would be something I could recover from in a few weeks. Dad brought my little sister Ivy to visit on day 5, and she started crying when she saw all the tubes and monitors attached to me. She was only 9 and didn't really understand what had happened, just that I'd fallen and hurt my back. I tried to smile and tell her I was okay, but my voice came out weak and unconvincing. Ivy asked when I was coming home, and I had to tell her I didn't know yet. Dad pulled her aside, and I could hear him explaining in simplified terms about my spine injury and the surgery. Ivy asked if it was going to be like when Grandma broke her hip and needed a walker, and Dad said it might be something like that, but we were hoping I'd recover more fully. After they left, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling and thinking about everything I might not be able to do anymore. I was supposed to start varsity soccer in the fall, and I'd been training all summer. Now I couldn't even walk across the room without help. A social worker came to talk to me about what resources would be available once I was discharged, and she mentioned home health care and adaptive equipment and outpatient rehab. All these things that made my new reality feel more permanent and terrifying. The police showed up on day 6 to take a statement about what had happened. A detective named Alvarez sat in my room with a notepad and asked me to walk through the events of that afternoon. I described helping Margot with the ladder and the fall and how long it took before anyone called 911. When I got to the part about them deciding to drive me to urgent care instead, Detective Alvarez stopped writing and asked me to repeat that. I explained about Margot not wanting to miss her book club and convincing Dad to take me to the clinic instead of calling an ambulance. The detective asked if I'd clearly communicated that I couldn't move my legs properly and that I was in severe pain, and I said yes, I'd been crying and begging them to call 911. He wrote everything down and said he'd need to talk to my father and stepmother as well. After he left, a nurse told me that delaying medical care for a child and moving someone with a suspected spinal injury against medical advice could potentially be considered criminal negligence. The thought that my dad might face legal consequences for choosing Margot's social event over my safety filled me with a complicated mix of satisfaction and grief. Dad came back later that evening, and I could tell he'd spoken with the police because his eyes were red and his voice was shaky. He sat down next to my bed and tried to apologize again, saying he'd made a terrible mistake and wasn't thinking clearly. I asked him how it was possible to not think clearly when your child is lying on the floor unable to move their legs, and he didn't have an answer. He kept saying Margot had convinced him it wasn't as serious as it seemed, and that he'd trusted her judgment because she'd worked as a medical receptionist years ago. I pointed out that a medical receptionist should definitely know better than to delay calling 911 for a spinal injury, and Dad just put his head in his hands. I asked him if Margot's book club was really more important than my ability to walk, and he started crying and saying of course not. But his actions on that day had clearly indicated otherwise, and no amount of crying now could change what had happened or reverse the damage to my spine. He eventually left when visiting hours ended, and I was alone with my thoughts and the steady beeping of monitors. Dr. Yates came by the next morning with updated test results. He said the swelling in my spinal cord was going down, which was good news, but there was evidence of what he called a contusion on the cord itself. He explained this was essentially a bruise on my spinal cord from the initial impact and the subsequent pressure from swelling. The contusion could heal over time, or it could result in permanent nerve damage. and we wouldn't know which for several weeks or possibly months. When I asked for percentages or probabilities, he said every spinal cord injury was different, and he couldn't give me definitive odds. He did say that the fact I had some movement and sensation in both legs was a positive sign, and that aggressive physical therapy would give me the best chance at maximum recovery. The physical therapist came back that afternoon, and we worked on sitting at the edge of the bed with my feet touching the floor. Just that simple position made my back ache and my legs tremble with the effort of supporting even that much weight. She said we'd work up gradually to standing with support, and eventually to taking steps with a walker. My mom flew in from Arizona on day 8, and the look on her face when she walked into my hospital room made me start crying. She'd divorced Dad when I was 6 and had moved away for work, and we'd maintained a decent relationship through video calls and holiday visits. Now she rushed to my bedside and hugged me carefully, avoiding all the tubes and wires, and asked what had happened. I told her everything from the beginning, and watched her expression change from concern to disbelief to fury. When I got to the part about Dad and Margot deciding to drive me to urgent care, Mom stood up and left the room. I could hear her in the hallway having a loud argument with Dad, and while I couldn't make out all the words, I definitely heard her call him criminally negligent and an unfit parent. When she came back in, she was still visibly angry, but trying to control it for my sake. She asked to speak with my doctors and got detailed information about my injury and prognosis, asking questions that Dad apparently hadn't thought to ask. She also contacted a lawyer who specialized in medical malpractice and child welfare cases, saying that what Dad and Margot had done absolutely constituted neglect. The lawyer, a woman named Rebecca Wolf, came to the hospital 2 days later and interviewed me about what had happened. She recorded everything with my permission and took detailed notes about the timeline and what was said. She explained that delaying emergency medical care for a minor with an obvious serious injury could be prosecuted as child endangerment, and that the delay in my case had directly contributed to worse outcomes. She said the urgent care clinic had documentation of what time we arrived and what the receptionist and nurse had said about needing to call 911 immediately, which supported my account of events. Rebecca said she'd be filing a complaint with Child Protective Services and would also be looking into whether there were grounds for a civil lawsuit regarding my injuries. Mom asked if there was any way to prevent Dad from having custody of Ivy given what had happened, and Rebecca said that would depend on what CPS found in their investigation. The thought of Ivy still living in that house with Dad and Margot, where a book club meeting had been prioritized over my spine, made me feel sick with worry. Physical therapy intensified during my second week in the hospital. The therapist, whose name was Nina, was encouraging but didn't sugarcoat how hard recovery would be. We worked on standing with a walker while Nina supported most of my weight, and even that brief effort left me exhausted and in pain. My right leg was still significantly weaker than my left and wouldn't bear weight properly, dragging slightly when I tried to move it. Nina said this asymmetry was common with spinal cord injuries, and that intensive therapy would hopefully restore more balanced function over time. We practiced the standing exercise twice a day despite how much it hurt, because Nina explained that the sooner we got my nerves firing and my muscles working, the better my long-term outcome would be. Between therapy sessions, I mostly lay in bed alternating between staring at my phone and sleeping, unable to focus on TV or books because my mind kept replaying that day, and all the moments where different choices could have changed everything. CPS showed up on day 14 to interview me privately. The caseworker, a man named Gerald Finch, had kind eyes but asked very direct questions about my home life with Dad and Margot. He wanted to know if there had been other instances of neglect, or if Margot had ever treated me poorly before the accident. I told him about how Margot often made comments about me being clumsy or dramatic, and how she'd convinced Dad that I was exaggerating various minor injuries over the past year. Gerald wrote everything down and said he'd be interviewing Dad, Margot, and Ivy separately as well. He asked if I felt safe going back to Dad's house once I was discharged, and I said honestly I didn't know. The thought of living under the same roof as someone who'd been willing to let me potentially become paralyzed rather than miss a social engagement was terrifying. But I also didn't want to be separated from Ivy, who'd already been through our parents' divorce, and didn't need more instability. Gerald said he understood the complexity of the situation, and that his goal was to ensure all the children in the home were safe and their needs were being prioritized. Mom started making arrangements to take extended leave from her job so she could stay in town during my recovery. She found a short-term rental apartment near the hospital, and said once I was discharged I'd be staying with her, not going back to Dad's house. Dad tried to argue about custody agreements, but Mom's lawyer shut that down quickly, pointing out that his recent choices regarding my medical care gave her grounds to petition for emergency custody modification. Dr. Yates cleared me for discharge on day 16, with instructions for intensive outpatient physical therapy 5 days a week. The hospital arranged for a wheelchair since I still couldn't walk more than a few steps with the walker, and Nina gave Mom detailed instructions about helping me with exercises at home. Walking out of the hospital in a wheelchair after being carried in on a stretcher felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life instead of living my own. Mom wheeled me to her rental car and helped transfer me into the passenger seat, a process that took several minutes and left both of us exhausted. The rental apartment was a small furnished place on the ground floor with no stairs, which Mom had specifically requested. She'd already bought a shower chair and installed grab bars in the bathroom, and had set up one of the bedrooms with a hospital bed she'd rented. The level of preparation she'd done in just a few days showed how seriously she was taking my care, which made the contrast with Dad's choices even more stark. That first night in the apartment, I tried to shower with Mom's help and ended up crying from a combination of pain, frustration, and humiliation at needing assistance with basic hygiene. Mom just held me while I cried and said we'd get through this together, that it was okay to be upset and scared and angry about what had happened. She helped me into bed afterward, and I fell asleep almost immediately, more exhausted than I'd ever been in my life. Physical therapy started the next day at an outpatient facility 20 minutes away, and Mom had to help me transfer from the wheelchair to the car, and then from the car to another wheelchair at the clinic. My physical therapist at the outpatient clinic was a man named Russell, who had apparently worked with many spinal cord injury patients. He did a thorough assessment of what I could and couldn't do, testing strength and range of motion and reflexes in both legs. My right leg was still significantly impaired with reduced reflexes and difficulty with voluntary movement, while my left leg was maybe 60% of normal function. Russell designed a therapy program that would work on rebuilding strength and retraining my nervous system to communicate properly with my muscles. The exercises were exhausting and painful, involving resistance bands and balance work and trying to walk between parallel bars while Russell supported my weight. After an hour, I was drenched in sweat and close to tears, and Russell said I'd done great for a first session. I couldn't imagine doing this 5 days a week for months, but Russell said consistency was absolutely critical for recovery, and missing sessions would significantly slow my progress. Mom drove me back to the apartment where I immediately collapsed into bed and slept for 3 hours. Dad started calling and texting constantly asking to see me, but I ignored most of his attempts at contact. Mom was handling communications with him through her lawyer regarding custody and medical expenses. The hospital bills were astronomical, already over $200,000 with more coming from the surgery and ongoing therapy. Dad's insurance would cover some of it, but there would be significant out-of-pocket costs, and Rebecca Wolf was building a case that Dad and Margot should be financially responsible for those costs given their negligence. CPS completed their investigation after 3 weeks and issued findings that Dad had exercised poor judgment that endangered my health and welfare. They mandated parenting classes and regular home visits if he wanted to maintain custody of Ivy, and they put our case on a monitoring list. Gerald Finch called to tell me these results and said that while they couldn't force criminal charges, their findings could be used in custody proceedings and civil lawsuits. The validation that an official agency had confirmed Dad's choices were wrong felt important, even though it couldn't undo the damage to my spine. My 16th birthday came and went without celebration while I was in the thick of daily therapy. Mom made a small cake and we ate it in the apartment, and Ivy came over with a card she'd made. Dad dropped her off and tried to come inside, but Mom blocked the door and said he wasn't welcome. Ivy gave me a long hug and whispered that she missed me and wished I'd come home, and I had to explain that I couldn't come back to Dad's house right now. She didn't fully understand and started crying, and Dad had to come collect her while she was still upset, which made me feel guilty even though none of this was my fault. After they left, Mom and I talked about long-term plans, and she said she was looking into transferring permanently to a position in this city so we could stay together during my recovery. The thought of starting over at a new school in a wheelchair filled me with dread. But staying in Dad's house was absolutely not an option, so this seems like the lesser of two bad choices. Physical therapy progress was maddeningly slow. After 6 weeks, I could walk short distances with a walker, but my right leg still dragged noticeably, and I had constant pain in my lower back. Russell said this was actually significant improvement given the severity of my injury, but it didn't feel significant when I couldn't walk normally or stand for more than a few minutes. The asymmetry in my legs was improving gradually, with my right side slowly regaining more function, but Russell warned it might never be completely equal to my left. He also said I'd probably always have some level of back pain, and would need to be careful about certain movements and activities. The realization that this injury would affect me for the rest of my life, that I'd never again take simple movement for granted, hit me at random moments and made me want to scream. I started seeing a therapist named Dr. Kim to help process the trauma and anger and grief, and she helped me understand that what I was feeling was completely valid and normal given what had happened. Rebecca Wolf filed a civil lawsuit against Dad and Margot 3 months after my injury, citing negligence and child endangerment. The lawsuit sought compensation for medical expenses, future therapy costs, pain and suffering, and potential long-term disability. Dad's lawyer tried to argue that it was a judgment call made in good faith, but Rebecca had the urgent care clinic's documentation of their staff saying I needed emergency care immediately, the paramedics' report noting the dangerous delay, and Dr. Okonkwo's testimony that the delay had likely worsened my outcome. Margot hired her own lawyer separate from Dad's and tried to claim she'd deferred to Dad's judgment as the parent, but Rebecca had my detailed account of Margot being the one who convinced Dad to delay calling 911. The legal process was slow and frustrating, with depositions and document requests and endless back and forth between lawyers. Meanwhile, I was still doing physical therapy 5 days a week and slowly regaining function, though Russell warned my progress would likely plateau at some point before I reached full recovery. I turned 17 in physical therapy, doing leg lifts with resistance bands while Mom sat in the waiting room. Russell brought in a cupcake with a candle and sang happy birthday, and I cried because this wasn't how I'd imagined spending this year of my life. I'd thought I'd be playing varsity soccer and learning to drive and applying to colleges, not relearning how to walk and dealing with chronic pain and suing my own father. The lawsuit settled out of court after 7 months, with Dad's insurance company agreeing to pay a significant sum to cover all my medical expenses, plus additional compensation for my injuries. Margot's insurance also contributed, though her lawyer negotiated a smaller amount. The money didn't change anything about my spine or my daily pain or the permanent limitations I now had, but at least I wouldn't be buried in medical debt for the rest of my life. Rebecca said the settlement was actually quite large and reflected how egregious Dad and Margot's conduct had been, that the insurance companies had decided it was cheaper to settle than risk a jury trial where the facts would make Dad and Margot look even worse. Physical therapy eventually transitioned to 3 days a week, then 2, as Russell said I'd reached the point where I'd plateaued in my recovery. I could walk without assistive devices but still had a noticeable limp, reduced sensation in my right foot, and chronic lower back pain that required daily medication. Russell said I'd made remarkable progress given the severity of my injury and the delay in treatment, but I'd never regained full normal function. The activities I'd loved before the injury, like soccer and running, were now largely impossible without risking re-injury to my spine. Russell helped me identify modified activities I could do safely, like swimming and certain types of cycling, but it wasn't the same. Dr. Kim helped me work through the grief of losing my pre-injury life and capabilities, and slowly I started accepting this new version of myself. Mom made her transfer permanent, and we found a real apartment to settle into, and I enrolled at the local high school for my junior year. Dad and I eventually started having supervised conversations at Dr. Kim's office, working towards some kind of relationship repair. He'd completed the CPS-mandated parenting classes and seemed genuinely remorseful, but I wasn't sure I'd ever fully trust him again. The knowledge that he'd chosen Margot's social event over potentially saving me from permanent injury created a crack in our relationship that I didn't know could be fully repaired. Ivy came to stay with Mom and me on weekends, and slowly we rebuilt our sisterly bond in a new context. She asked questions about my limp and my scars, and why I couldn't do some things anymore, and I tried to answer honestly in age-appropriate ways. Dad and Margot divorced 8 months after my injury, with Dad saying he realized she'd had a toxic influence on his judgment and parenting. Whether that was true or just a convenient narrative, I wasn't sure, but at least Ivy wouldn't be living with Margot anymore. 2 years after the fall, I graduated high school with decent grades despite having missed significant time for medical appointments and therapy. My limp was less pronounced but still noticeable, and I had to take breaks to sit down during the graduation ceremony because standing too long made my back hurt. Mom cried when they called my name and I walked across the stage, probably remembering a time when it wasn't clear if I'd walk again at all. Dad was there too, sitting several rows back, and when I made eye contact with him, he smiled sadly and gave a small wave. I waved back, a gesture of acknowledgement but not forgiveness, because some things can't be forgiven even when you understand they came from weakness rather than malice. I'd learned to live with my altered body and my chronic pain and the knowledge that one person's selfish choice had permanently changed my life. And I'd learned that sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you will fail in spectacular and devastating ways, and all you can do is survive it and build something new from the wreckage they left behind. Appreciate you watching this far. If you enjoyed it, drop a like, leave a comment, and subscribe so you won't miss the next story.